please join me in welcoming Rob McInnes today from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. We both are members of the Toronto Postcard Club, as well as a lot of other people here today. But we met because of a presentation, or a portion of this presentation, that he gave a couple of months ago to the Toronto Postcard Club. I was fascinated by what he had to say and how he had it all together, and the similarities between Canadian and U.S. postcards and small towns, and how we love them and how they're documented on postcards. His title today is Kenora and Keewatin, Postcards, Photographers, Publishers, and Retailers. Please join me in welcoming Rob.
Hey, Hal. It is really great to be here. Thank you. I really, if I forget at the end, Hal, I just want to thank you for your invitation. It was really exciting to get it, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I hope I do the topic justice. So here we go. Yeah, I love these two little towns, and I've been collecting postcards of them for quite a long time. And one thing that occurred to me was that because it was a small town, it presented me with an opportunity to, as a microcosm, see what the interplay was like between the photographers who were taking the pictures, producing the real photo postcards, but also having their photos turned into printed postcards by other publishers and things, and then also how the publishers and retailers interacted, and the retailers with the photographers. And it's been really a fascinating journey of trying to pull those links together. And I'm going to kind of take you there this morning, or this afternoon, excuse me. So here is a picture of Kenora. It's kind of looking southwest. This is the main street of Kenora, back in about 1912, 1914. And nowadays, if you go down that street right to about here and look to your right, you'll find the Lake of the Woods Museum. And I'm sitting in the basement there right now, and Braden is upstairs. It's a great little town to visit, and I'll actually bring that up in a minute. So let's get going. This is some geographical orientation to this whole thing. Toronto is over here, and people from Toronto know that, but some of them don't know where Keewatin is. But by the way, thank you. There's people from the Toronto Postcard Club here watching my presentation for a second time. There probably might be a new joke or two, but the rest is all the same. So Winnipeg is where I live, in province of Manitoba. And right here at the top of this little lake is where the Keewatin area, or in Kenora area, which we're going to look at today. And you guys are, I don't know, down south here somewhere in Wichita. So this is Lake of the Woods, and take a closer look at Lake of the Woods. It's an incredible little lake. So you can see it's got about 15,000 islands, and just a gigantic total shoreline of the lake. In fact, it's in one reference book I saw, it has actually the largest shoreline of any freshwater lake in the world. But that's due to all the islands and all their shorelines being added into it. I wanted to focus on this little area here as part of the discussion, particularly because of the Americans in the audience. This little spot here is called the Northwest Angle. It is actually a non-contiguous part of the United States. It is actually part of Minnesota. Although here's the border, this dotted red line is the border between Canada and the US. And you'll see this doesn't touch the US land in any way. And if they want to get to the rest of Minnesota, they have to drive through the province of Manitoba to get there if they're going by car. But of course, a lot of them just go by boat. So it's a kind of fascinating little place. By the way, in the last, the 2010 census, there was less than 200 people that live there year round. And its primary industry is tourism. So the part of Kenora or the part of the Lake of the Woods we're going to look at is right up near the north end of it. This is the town of Kenora. It's quite bigger than anywhere else around here. There are 3 towns that are actually part of, you're going to see pictures of through the presentation. This is Kenora. This is Keewatin over here. And this is Norman, a small town of Norman. Actually, a few years back, not too many. It's in my lifetime, these 3 towns were all joined together under and are all part of Kenora now. Although those of us who've been around on the planet for a little longer than others still call them by Keewatin, Norman, and Kenora. Prior to 1905, Kenora was actually called Rat Portage, and they changed their name in the middle of 1905 after 20 years of going at it as to whether they should change their name or not. Up here, this little star, this is this end of the Lake of the Woods had an Indian name or indigenous name it was the part of the country where the muskrats migrated, and so it was that was kind of translated into English as Rat Portage, and it was called that. And the Hudson's Bay Company, the major fur trading company in the country, established a trading post there and a little fort, which was there. I think how long? Braden, well, it doesn't really matter that much. But after about, I think, 30 years there or so, they decided they want to be part of the mainland. That it didn't work for them being on this island, so they actually moved down here. A little bit of settlement grew around them, and eventually became the town of Kenora. So it just as that community and town developed, it was also referred to Rat Portage, the same as the old fort, until the point where they decided to change the name to Kenora. So this here is Keewatin down here. This is the north, right across this channel. The strip of land has been the hive of their industrial activities, the major economic drivers behind the community, which were mining, ore processing, and lumbering, and in the later years, milling flour. So you'll see some pictures of that through this. There's also a little bridge here in the town of Norman called the Norman Dam. It's not a bridge, sorry, it's a dam, and it was built in the late 1800s, and later on, I think in the 20s, became actually a generating plant for supply the area with electricity. So those are just some of the sites that you'll see on the postcards I'm going to show. The name Kenora came from the K-E in Keewatin, the N-O in Norman, and the R-A from Rat Portage. It was kind of an interesting evolution. I actually met a girl a few years ago whose name was Kenora. And I said, do you know where your name came from? And she had no idea. She was quite thrilled to learn that background. Before we get into what Keewatin and Kenora used to look like, this is some present day pictures to show you what a beautiful little town this is and why I'm always so delighted to be here and why Braden is so lucky to live here. That's where you want to stay when you come to visit here. And that's a picture of the beautiful, bustling little downtown with a lot of historic buildings still intact. This is the last slide. Safeway, you don't have a Safeway in Wichita, but you do have roughly 1,000 stores across the US and about 200 in Canada. And this is the Kenora Safeway. And it is the only Safeway in all of the Safeway properties that has a boat docking facility that they maintain for their customers. For people coming off the lake, they can just come by boat and dock there. And it was a presentation the Safeway manager did a couple of years ago, and he said when he called the head office and said, we need to replace our docks, nobody at like Safeway corporate headquarters had any clue what he was talking about. Took him a while to convince them. Anyways, these are my personal credentials for doing this presentation. This is me at 1 year old, 2 years old, and 3 years old on a little island outside of the town of Keewatin. And just to prove that's really where I am, I was wearing my Kenora t-shirt. So I've been collecting postcards for somewhat over 25 years. And this place has been a place that I've loved for 72 years. So those are my basic credentials for being here today. And I hope it comes through in the presentation. So this is just a fun postcard. We're going to go back in time with these characters. They were this was probably taken to the train station at some point. So here's an early postcard of the main street of Kenora. We saw it a little bit earlier from a different angle. This is one of the old fire stations, a really beautiful one that burned down eventually. This building is the side of a building that we'll see in the later postcard pictures. That was the post office and customs building at the time, and has been restored and kept up through the years, and it's now the town hall here. And this is the little town of Keewatin. We're looking south here, and probably from the mills I was talking about, the photo looking south on the town, with at the time when it was obviously processing lumber, because the whole channel was full of logs. So the population of these three towns during the period of the postcards we'll be looking at, Kenora was roughly between 5,000 or 6,000 people, Norman less than 500 people, and Keewatin somewhere between 100 and 1,500 people. It gives you an idea of the relative size. And for all of them, the primary industries were mining, forestry, paper and flour mills, and tourism. So what we're going to look at is the kind of three players and major players in producing postcards and retailing them. We're going to take a look at major publishers in Canada and their activity in this area. We're going to look at the individual photographers I've been able to identify who were responsible for both the real photo postcards and for most of the images that are used in the printed postcards. And then the retailers who were partnering with both photographers and publishers to produce postcards of this town in this particular area. So we're going to start with photographers. This gentleman actually was from Winnipeg. He's one of the most famous early real photo postcard producers in the province of Manitoba. He basically was only active in Winnipeg from about 1903 to 1906, but his postcards are very valuable to collectors like Andrew Cunningham, who's here, and myself. We met because we were bidding against each other too much. He produced about roughly 20 real photo postcards of the Kenora area in the summer of 1905. And as to my knowledge, they're the area's earliest commercial real photo postcards. And one of them, which I'll show you, only one of them was reproduced as a colored printed postcard by one of the big companies, W.G. McFarlane Company. My earliest postcard of his is dated July 18th, 1905. This is one of his images. Again, it's of Main Street. It's looking south. There's that fire hall. Here's the post office. And this is all when it was dirt streets. But it's a good picture of the major commercial part of the town. This is another of his, which shows just the west side of the main street in a little more detail, but shows the bay, the beautiful bay that is it's just gorgeous, and it makes the city look so beautiful sitting on the shores of that body of water. This was probably, these both were in my collection for probably a year or so before I realized that they actually had something in common, and was able to do this panorama with using the two of them. They joined up really nicely. And this is one of his of the little town of Keewatin. Again, it's from the mill side. This is where the railways ran across, basically the trains that ran east to west across Canada came through this spot. Over here was the wooden traffic bridge that early on served the community. And this was a wooden bridge that was built especially for the laborers in the mills, that they could walk across here to get to work every day. And there was a little note on the bottom here, which just tells how much the beauty of this little town was appreciated by one of its visitors. This is another of his. This is the dam I was talking about, the Norman Dam. This is before it was a power station, generating station. It was a very popular place for, and still is, for people to go fishing. And I just love the composition of this picture. And I'm going to admit here, I have only recently come to appreciate what you can do by adding color to some of the black and white pictures. And so I have what I think is a really decent program. I paid $50 for, and I can just drop a picture into the program and it pops up the color version of it. And this is how this one turned out. I was actually really happy with it, because it just kind of brings some. I really hesitated tinkering with the black and whites, but once I did, I just think they had a real special beauty, so I do it occasionally. Here's his moose pictures. You can see there's two young moose and they're chained up here, and that was one of his, and that was turned into a real photo, color, or not a real photo, of a color printed postcard. And of course, because they were coloring them, they just colored out the chains, which was kind of interesting. Okay, another prominent photographer was this guy, George Edward Whiten. And he grew up in the province of Ontario, worked in many different places in Ontario, basically didn't arrive into Kenora until he was well into his career and in his 50s, I believe. And I have no evidence that he was tinkering with postcards at all prior to his time in Kenora. This is not George, the picture. As often as I can, I try and get pictures of these folks. The best I could do, this was a cabinet card he produced in Ontario, and I thought, well, if that's not him, at least it's an image I can remember. I've contacted his family or his descendants trying to get a picture of him, but nobody's been able to come up with one yet. So his photos, he printed real photos himself. He had sets of black and white printed postcards done by both the McFarlane Company and Valentine's Sons. Valentine's Sons did some US postcards, did a ton of Canadian postcards. They were headquartered in Dundee, Scotland. And there's something like over 22,000 postcard images that they produced in Canada alone. And they were active throughout the British Empire. So my earliest real photo of his was April 1906. This is just a contest he won early in his career as a photographer, where photographers from both Canada and the US were competing, and he won 2 first prizes. So he was a photographer of repute. This is, I think, the earliest real photo I have of his. He helped me by identifying himself, so I know it's his. These photographers were taking these pictures, and often they would follow a sequence of events which led them to come out in other formats. In this case, this little section of this picture ultimately showed up as its own printed postcard. This one was published by McFarlane Company. They did a small series of his cards. This is another one of his real photos. I believe this is probably a lumber company, but it could have been a mining company, which had to take supplies in. And the person who wrote on the letter here is just explaining that travel up here in the winter with snow sleds and dogs. They couldn't use horses in the wintertime. So this was a black and white printed card of his. It was published by the Valentine Company. Like McFarlane, they produced a small set of his cards, and they were among the first postcards that they actually produced in Canada. The Valentines sometimes don't, in fact, like this one didn't recognize Valentine at all on the card, printed anywhere in the card. But when you see this number of 6 numerals, Valentine numbered most of all their cards. So this one was in the 102 series. They reproduced this later on as a color card and renumbered it as 601163. So okay, that's that for William White. I'll make reference to all these photographers as we go on. William Noble Marr produced. I've only come across about 24 cards that are for sure credit to him, though there's a lot of other ones that I suspect are his, but he didn't sign them. None of his that I know of were ever produced as printed cards, but I really like the few cards that he did produce because I think he had a real talent for being creative in what he was doing. So this is one called the Keewatin Beach, where a lot of the wealthier people mostly folks who come from Winnipeg actually would buy these properties that were beachfront properties and build these semi-mansions that they called summer cottages. But here's what, he colorized some of his postcards, which I've not seen in evidence from any of the other photographers of the area here. This is one he did of, it says football, but it's actually obviously soccer. And it was the team from Keewatin, and they had won this trophy. It's another card that I chose to colorize. And again, it turned out favorably. I thought because it kind of, when you see people in color, you kind of relate to them easier than you relate to black and white people, I think. It just brings their humanity out in some special way. But just thought I'd show it to you. This is one of his. Most of his were in the town of Keewatin, where he lived. He also worked at the mill that some of the other photographers worked at. This is the Argyle. It's a ferry boat. We'll talk about a little later on, that plied between Kenora and Keewatin as a major form of transportation between the two communities. This was a sternwheeler called the Agwind, and this large boat was called the Kenora, which was the, I think, largest steamship in those days plying the Lake of the Woods. This is another example where he was really innovative. Nobody else here produced these kind of composite multi-view cards. And he just, they were all of particularly well-known spots in the area. Okay, I believe this is the last photographer. His name is William Woodhouse. He's kind of my favorite. I have to admit to having favorites, but he was a postman who left England in 1904, headed for Winnipeg, but ended up in Kenora and signed on with the mill there. His wife joined him the following year. He worked at the mill, but somewhere along the line started taking pictures and building his own little photography business. He loved this place so much. He kept trying to convince his sister and her husband to move to Canada from England. And in 1910, they sent their 2 sons over, and they absolutely loved the place. That was them back in the picture we just looked at, his 2 nephews. And you can imagine, they came from a big bustling city in England, and they're out in the wilderness hauling guns around as teenagers. Like, no wonder they loved it. He did a lot of real photo postcards, really prolific. And somewhere around 1910, I believe, he did a deal with the Pew Manufacturing Company, another large postcard manufacturer in Canada, and they used his prints exclusive, or his pictures exclusively for the cards they were pumping out of Kenora area. In 1910, in 1914, he volunteered to go to war. So that was the end of it, and of his postcarding. He survived the war, but was in poor health, and decided it wasn't enough for him. It was bad, poor enough. He didn't come back to Canada, although in England he called their cottage they lived in Keewatin. So he never lost his love of the place. And my earliest postcard of his was June 1907. This is a sample of one of his pictures. These are the flour mills in Keewatin. This is the wooden bridge I pointed out earlier. And this is the channel that ran between the mills and the town itself. This is more of the channel, and this is the back end of the railway station. And these are another two cards that I had separately in my collection for a number of years. And then all of a sudden thought, oh, sorry, WW. That's some of his cards he signed WW in his, and so I could, but he didn't do them all, much to my chagrin. But I could use the lettering here and the style of lettering to identify a number of other cards that he did produce. Anyways, those two cards just happened to go together perfectly. Which was kind of thrilling for me. This is the major hotel in Kenora in past years, called the Tourist Hotel, where the Kenrisha, beautiful old hotel, and it's been a landmark of the city for decades, although right now it's fallen on hard times, and all these beautiful balconies have been dismantled, but it's still there on the main commercial corner of town. This is the Kenora train station and the accompanying gardens. I don't know if you have this in the US, but most of the major train stations in Canada, even some of the minor ones, all had these gardens outside of them. So even if it was a whistle stop, you could go up and sort of stroll around through the, nice flowers and flower gardens and things, or bring your snowshoes and hike around the snow. In the winter time. So this train was sent to, or this card was sent to someone in Truro, Nova Scotia, which is out on the east coast of Canada. And so the sender had put these arrows on this way to Truro and this way to Winnipeg. This is back to Keewatin, and one of his, and this is the train station again. And because it was very busy, this was a favored vacation spot for people from Manitoba, especially, and the people who could afford it from other parts of Ontario. But the train would arrive regularly, and this was called the Campers Dock, and people would get off the train. It was often on the weekends. It was the husbands. They'd go back to Winnipeg to work during the week, and then they'd come back on the weekends. And so their families would park and wait for them to arrive, or as in the case here, this is the Calypso, is a boat that served as a water taxi. So they could climb on the Calypso and get shuffled over to their properties that were either on islands or on parts of the mainland that didn't have any roads, where they only had water access. And I tinkered around with the coloring on this one as well. And I thought the mahogany came out really nicely on this one. Most of you saw in that one too. Whoops, there, that one. Most of the Canadian flag itself wasn't that popular back in those days, but the Union Jack was flying on most of the boats and cottages, which was the British flag. This is one of his. It was a photograph that he produced as a real photo postcard himself. But once he aligned with the Pew Manufacturing Company, they produced it as this color postcard. The one funny thing about this guy's mustache was drawn in with a pen or something. It was kind of weird, because the rest of it was done really nicely. Oh, last photographer. Sorry, this was the main photographer of Kenora. His career there as a photographer lasted from about 1905, 1906 through to a few years past 1928. He was very prolific. He loved the area. He'd kind of go and sail out on his boat on sometimes and just see people picnicking on an island and go say, "Do you want to get your picture taken?" But he's got pictures of the most of the news events that happened and the buildings, and it's a real gift to the town of Kenora that they have his work to show what the town looked like in its early days. We only recently discovered, those of us who are actually interested in these guys, that in 1909, Carl Lind actually purchased the studio of George Whiten, and which was just a real boon to him because Whiten had all the top photographic equipment and everything. And he not only got all his equipment, he got the rights to basically all of his negatives that he did while he was here. So Carl Lind was able to sell some of those negatives to publishers to make postcards as well. This is one of his photographs. This is the second story of the rowing club here in town, and they would have a summer regatta every summer where all the fancy boats would come out and show off and things like that. So this balcony is just full of people watching that regatta in 1910. These are some folks who worked on a tie mill, which was basically a lumber mill that produced railway ties as the railways were built up in this area. This one I particularly like. It's a mine, and I think it's just a gorgeous picture with the reflection and all that. And it happens to be on a lake called Shoal Lake, which is attached to Lake of the Woods. It happens to be the one where my family and I have a cabin, and I've actually, before I ever saw this picture, I was exploring the ruins of the mine. This one was of the new government dock that was built at the end of Main Street. Braden and I are just up here in current day. So this was built, and the note on the back says, note Peter with straw hat and press badge. Well, that's like, where's Waldo? Like, there's all these guys with like straw hats. And so to save you your time anyways, I just, this is Peter, and there's his press badge. But like I said, he captured so many of the events and happenings in town for history, which was great. So now we'll move on to some publishers. And again, I'm just focusing on major companies and publishing companies in Canada and their activity in this area. So the first one is Valentine and Sons. This is what the back of their cards typically look something like that. And they were from, like, again, Dunby, Scotland. They initially had offices in Toronto and Montreal, and later they added Winnipeg as the West opened up. This is another of the early Whiten photographs. And this shows, again, this was one that has this strange back that didn't mention them at all, but you can tell because of that number on the back of the, or on the, excuse me, on the front of the card. That's always a Valentine card when you see that number. And that's what the front of this card looks like. This is one of the hospitals here in Kenora, one of the early ones. This one was actually attributed to the Woods drugstore, who formed a relationship with Valentine's, and there's relatively, only 20 of the 75 Kenora area cards I know of were attributed directly to Valentine's, and the rest were attributed to Woods drugstore with no mention of Valentine's themselves. And this is one of the pictures. This is another angle of the post office, which has become the city hall. The note on the back of this is from the writer, a young woman who said that this essentially, this layer of the building is where the caretaker and family would live. So she put a little X on the window to let the person know that she was writing to where they were living. And I found out, because I picked up this postcard, this is a real photo by Carl Lind, and that's obviously taken from that photograph. I thought this was interesting too, that back in like 1908, you could buy a birch bark canoe for $15. This is probably the most famous picture in the postcard world of the Kenora train station. This is also the old central school here in Kenora that isn't in operation anymore. And this shows again the garden with the little fountain. A little later on, I'll show you a picture of the YMCA building, and it's off to this side. It's off to the right of this picture. So that was original black and white print. This is actually a real photo that came out. This wasn't a real photo that it is his Whiten photo, but this isn't his postcard. It was a real photo. I think it was put out by Carl Lindy, who inherited all his negatives, and I think he just republished it and made some money off of it. This is the Valentine version of it, the Valentine and Sons version, colors. And then this is a later version of theirs where they fancied up the frame. And then this one is a version where they took out the pole. And this is another publisher who, again, they took out the pole. That pole was not moving anywhere when the photographer, when Whiten was there. He had to, but it just shows what you could do with some of the pictures when you were turning them into colorized versions of themselves. So another publisher was the McFarlane Company. I know of at least 57 cards that have been produced here. 11 of them were published under Johnson Pharmacy's name. 7 of them were based on George Whiten photographs. 14 were a set by a fellow named George Barker. And by the way, I put plus signs on this because these are the ones I've identified, and I know there's more. But I do think I've probably got 80% of most of what's out there with these sets. So they contributed a lot of cards to the Kenora area. This is one of them. This is early on of the sort of waterfront of the town. And it was when it was called Rat Portage, so it was pre-1905. And sorry, I missed mentioning that, sorry. This was issued by the Johnson Pharmacy Company. This is another one that was put out by Johnson's Pharmacy, but it was a McFarlane card. It's the fire procession going down the street here. And this would have been the Canadian flag of the time. So the fellow who wrote this is the note he wrote on the back, saying that he basically is enjoying, he was pleased that he moved to Canada. This is one of the ones, those of you who collect older cards, just find fascinating that when parades were on, that people would be standing on the top of the buildings or hanging out the windows like they are up here. So this was one of the set produced by George Barker, but published by McFarlane. This is the train bridge going into Kenora. And this is the steamer Argyle that was, again, it was primarily just a ferry back and forth between the 3 communities and also a place called Coney Island. So there were 4 major stops the ferry made on those trips. This is a kind of an iconic, I don't know what you call it, it's a rock. And but it resembled the devil, even to the indigenous folks who lived here before. And in, I guess, early 1900s or late 1800s, somebody took to painting it to make it more obvious that it was the devil. And it's called the devil. And the little area, it's where the body of water narrows a little bit, and it's called Devil's Gap. And it's there we have a tour boat that still runs here, and it goes through the Devil's Gap. It has to, as part of its trip, showing the tourists the layout. This is a boat race. They happened a lot here throughout the summer. The town of Kenora is actually back over this way. And this is where the train ran into town. This one actually came originally from a Keewatin postcard. And it actually had a life of its own. I guess I took it out, but it also showed up several times as a colorized postcard or printed postcard. This is one of the private yachts that plied the waters here. They were all mostly driven by steam, the early ones. So now we're moving to a different publisher. This is Stedman Brothers. And Stedman Brothers published a lot of the Johnson Pharmacy postcards. Again, they weren't necessarily mentioned. There's only a total of 20, but Stedman Brothers is a big national publisher, but they weren't really too involved here. Oh, there it is. There's that picture again of the sailing races on a Stedman card. And there's another one of the Argyle. And this one is pretty amazing. This beautiful picture of this lovely woman paddling a canoe. Oh, let's go back to her. I thought I had a note there. This woman actually, it's interesting. Stedman Brothers published this postcard, and it's just amazing. They were able to have the canoe and the woman in exactly the same position with exactly the same background in 30 different communities across, more than 30 different communities across Canada. So this same picture shows up on over 30 postcards, but giving a different location every time. This is another one of the boats, these early steamboats that were out here. They're called the Verbena. And this is again the flour mills in Keewatin, Stedman card with a fancy frame. And there's another one of the Devil's Gap. And then we're moving on to the Pew Specialty Company now. They published somewhere over 44 different color cards of the area. And those all were attributed to Woodhouse. Actually, his name was on the back of all the cards that they published that were his original photos. And they only published 4 that didn't mention Woodhouse. So this is what they look like. It'd be they'd number all their cards, and they'd identify themselves, but they'd identify the photographer as well. So this is one of them. This was one that was published by the Stedman Company. It only mentioned the Stedman Company, didn't mention a photographer, but I've encountered and actually have a copy of the real photo that were done by Carl Lindy. It's a beautiful card. I think it's just such a fascinating, busy card. And this is the back of that stern wheeler, the Agwind. And for any of you who've been to Kenora, this is an old bandstand that doesn't exist anymore, but it was the town's bandstand in those days. This is another one where Pew published it. No photographers mentioned, but have the original Keewatin photographs, so we know that that's where that one came from. This is another of Woodhouse's pictures. This is the big boat I had mentioned, the Kenora. And that was the White House's, or excuse me, William Woodhouse's original photo of the boat. I also collect, or have collected in the past, not quite as active, but lawn bowling pictures and postcards. And this is one beside the YMCA in Keewatin, or excuse me, in Kenora. And this is a picture of the commercial hotel here, which I've not seen another postcard that actually has that establishment on it. I think some of you probably saw this earlier on in the promotion for today's presentation. This is the Argyle, and I actually have some notes here I'm looking at. But just to give them more information on it, this particular ferry was launched in 1900. And this dock was actually built by and provided by a number of retail merchants in the area, because they thought it would be to their benefit to have the boat loading and unloading passengers right next to where their stores were. It lasted until 1935. It was in service, and then was replaced by the Argyle II, which continued to act as a ferry. And that one was replaced in 1960. Oh, excuse me, 19. What? Oh my God! Here, 1986 was the new boat, which is called the Kenora. And in later years, when the highway was the actual highway, which was gravel road, was completed in like the 50s. The need for the ferries really diminished, so they took on the added roles as a tourist boats, and they would also be available for private rentals for parties and things like that. Great boat, though. This bank is just a block away from where we're sitting, right? Braden and I are sitting right now, and the building is still there. It's been a series of really great restaurants, and it's currently called The Vault. And again, another really successful restaurant here in town. And the Bijou Theater is no longer a theater, but the building's still there, and it serves great Fat Boy hamburgers if you come to town. Okay, the last publisher is the Novelty Manufacturing and Art Company. So they produced 7+ real color postcards. And then they did 2 sets of Carl Lindy's. And one was what I call a brown tone, and I'll show you an example of it. And the others were a kind of monotone linen postcards. I put 10++ and 6++ because I think there are very many more that I don't have, exceedingly more than what I have, but the total I know of is 23. So these are 2 of the postcards that the regular color postcards that they produced, and were and the Novelty Manufacturing Company name is on them. And this one, I think this is one of the nicest full color postcards of that old hotel, and it's theirs. It was just a grand place, and it's hard to look at it nowadays and know what it used to look like. So this is the brown, what I call the brown tone series, and you'll see Lindy's net recognized in the title of these cards, all of them. It's a really interesting sort of colorized version. These were the linen ones. They came basically printed in black ink, either on this yellowish kind of background or on this gray one. This is one of the what they call pockets along the dam of the Norman Dam, and each one of them can be raised or lowered individually. This is another dam that actually preceded that one, and a powerhouse that preceded the one that was eventually built over here. And this This one was the original provider of electricity to the town, and both of these generating stations are still in operation. So now we've got to the retailers. Wood's Drug Store was we call a secondary publisher of Valentine's card. Valentine name didn't show on the cards. They were produced by, just shown as being from Wood's Drug Store. And then there was also a second set of cards that had the name of the Wood's Drug Store on them, but were actually Rumsey and Company cards. And they were also featuring exclusively Carl Lindy photos. So there's at least a total of 75 cards there, which is quite a few. This was just looking down the road here. I wonder if I can do that again. Oh, no. There it is. Okay, Wood's Drug Store. So this is a traffic bridge that goes over the railway tracks, and this building still exists here in the town. And so it's kind of fun to know where they were actually operating. This is the site of the YMCA, and we should see a picture of it shortly. This is that old fire station with a really neat tower. Keewatin literally burns through its fire halls. I think it's on the 4th now. And they all met their demise at the hands of flames. And this one was a beauty. It's a beautiful card, just the image itself. This is kind of fun. This is one of the other hospitals here in Kenora. It's across the bay from the main town. This is horse racing. So the horses were actually pulling sleds that were on runners. And apparently they broke the world's record for a half mile. But it doesn't say anything about the year it's happened. And so far, all the historians I've talked to have no clue as to when this record-breaking thing took place. But horse races were popular out in the bay in the wintertime. Whether or not they were championship ones, it was a popular sport here. And this is the central school that we saw in the background of the image of the train station. And again, I should have it, but I don't know the year that it went out of commission. But a lot of people are still alive, are still recounting their memories of going there to school on the Kenora's History Facebook page. This is a view of the town of Keewatin, and it shows, I guess this would be from the southeast corner of town, and looking in towards where the mills, that you can't see the channel between the town and the mills there, but that's where they are. And it was actually derived from another Whiten real photo. So this is the set that Rumsey and Company put out featuring Carl Lind's work, or Lindy, I'm sorry, and his name appeared on all of these as well. This is another one of a different steamboat that was on the waters here, the Kathleen. And this is the Indian Residential School, was in Keewatin, in Kenora for a long time. It isn't in operation anymore. And then we have Johnson's Pharmacy. So they were the longest, I think, sort of drugstore or retailer that was mixed up in this stuff with postcards. Before I do that, I forgot to tell you something which is really interesting around postcard collecting. I meant to tell you when we were looking at the train station pictures. The retailers here, like any other tourist town, focus on selling postcards of their town. I actually got this information all from a postcard that was sent from a guy from Newfoundland, Canada, back home. He was here for a few years, and he was just the poor guy was all these people were writing him, send us postcards, send us postcards. So I think all his weekends were spent like writing postcards and sending. He was complaining on the cards too. But what he had to do actually is he would go once a week over to Kenora for when the train actually had a stop that lasted for a period of time, because that train that went from coast to coast in Canada was picking up passengers and dropping them all over the place, and people were moving. And they had a huge selection of postcards from all across the country. So he could go there and get pictures of, British Columbia or Alberta or whatever, and send them back to Newfoundland as well, because of the postcard collection that was, or postcard store that was on the trains. So we're back to the Johnson's Pharmacy anyways. There were McFarland produced cards that had Johnson's Pharmacy's name on it. Stedman Brothers put out cards that had Johnson's Pharmacy on it. And then there was some identified publishers that also produced some cards that bore Johnson's Pharmacy name. And this building and the business are still in operation just down the street from us here. So this is actually the earliest postcard that I have from Rat Portage, Kenora area, and it's of the falls here. And so it would issued by Johnson in Rat Portage. So this obviously was pre-1905. This is from a set. They're really beautiful for being as early as they are, or as early as they were produced. I'm just, two of them I'm suspicious of. I don't think they're real Kenora photos. I think they met with the theme of Kenora, so they used the pictures, but they weren't actual pictures of here. We saw one of these of the fire station earlier on, and this is one of the Devil's Gap. This photograph was taken in front of that old fire station that we've seen pictures of. And it was sometime in the 1800s, and I don't know who the photographer was, but it was turned into this black and white postcard. And this is the YMCA. And when Hal had seen this presentation, first time around, he was pretty surprised that we had such a fancy YMCA in a little town like this. And the story on it, you see that actually it tells the story here in the caption. RWY is railway. So it's the Railway YMCA in Kenora, Ontario. And essentially the railway company financed the building of this to accommodate their single workers, their unattached workers. So it was very, very nice building, and the meals and everything about it was very nice. And it's now doesn't look like itself. The outside has been totally changed, but it's a Legion Hall now. And this is over to Keewatin, where now the mills are over back this way, and we're looking down at the rail side of the railway station. This is what's called a log boom out there. There were logs connected by chains that formed the circumference and kept all the logs inside of it, and they would be towed by tugboats up and down. Well, they would be harvested down the lake in the southerly part of the lake and hauled up to the mills in the form of these log booms. We're quickly approaching the end of my presentation, and I can't do justice to either the town or the presentation without mentioning the Kenora Thistles. As I subtitle on this is The Pride of K-Town. Particularly for the younger crowd, K-Town has become what they affectionately call their town, not Kenora. It's kind of cool to call it K-Town. And this is the copy. Actually, you know what? I'm sitting in the museum here, and just behind the wall here is one of the original uniforms won by the Kenora, or worn by the Kenora Thistles back in the 1900s, early 1900s. This is the team. Because they were so far away, they're on the extreme west of the long province of Ontario, highly populated in the east province of Ontario. They had basically, it was made sense for them to participate in the Manitoba League, not the Ontario League. And in 1906, they won the championship trophy for the Manitoba League. Now, what that did, oh, sorry, and this picture was taken, the original picture for that postcard I discovered online was actually a photo by George Whiten here in Kenora. What it did is by winning the Manitoba Championship, it enabled the Thistles to make a challenge to the Stanley Cup, ultimate goal or the ultimate trophy in hockey. I should explain that the game was different in those days. Nowadays, hockey is played by clubs play all year long. They, based on their record, they enter a tourney, and the winner of the tournament wins the Stanley Cup. Back in those days, if your team had won the Stanley Cup, you kept it as long as you beat every challenger. But if a challenger beat you, a challenging team, they got to take it home with them. So if you, during one hockey year, a team that was holding the cup might have to play up to 3 or 4 games in the year to retain it for themselves. So the Thistles were able to challenge the Montreal Wanderers, who held in 1907 for the cup. If your challenge was accepted, you actually had to pay for your team to travel all the way, which was like halfway across the country for these guys. They had to go to Montreal and play for the tournament. So the tournament was held in 1907, and it was on January 18th, this postcard was sent, and I believe one of the games had already been completed the day this postcard was sent. And the note on the back of this one said, leaving tonight for Winnipeg, great excitement here over the Stanley Cup games in Montreal. So here's what happened. The Montreal Wanderers, the way it was played also was a 2-game challenge match, and the highest combined score from the 2 games was the winner. So the Thistles won the first game on January 17th. The final game was held on January 21st, and Kenora won a total of 12 goals to 8 in the 2 games. So Kenora had the Stanley Cup winning hockey team in 1907. But the Thistles still hold the 2 Stanley Cup records that will likely never be surpassed. They are, for one, that they're the smallest community to have ever won the Stanley Cup. And number 2 was the team that held the Stanley Cup for the shortest period of time. They only held it for about 2 months, and then the Wanderers came back at them and took it away again. So that's kind of the end of our little sightseeing journey and my presentation. And thank you so much for taking time out on your Saturday to join us here. Take it away, Hal.
Very good. Thank you, Rob. That's just amazing all over again. We practice these programs, and so I've seen it several times, and it's just it's better each time. I'll say that for sure. That Kenora Stanley Cup postcard. Tell us a little bit more about that, Rob, if you would, please.
Well, I don't know what to say, but there are very few of them. They are it's one of those things where your postcard collect, you know, like if you're collecting postcards, you know, if a train station comes up, like the prices like skyrockets. And it's basically the same with sports cards, right? And because the Thistles, it was so early in the years of hockey, and the Thistles retained the cup for such a short period of time, there aren't a whole lot of their cards around. So like I had, even collecting, seriously collecting, I thought, I'm never going to get it. Like I'll never have one of those cards. And oddly enough, using eBay, one day I logged on early in the morning and there was a new listing for the Kenora Thistles. It was a black and white version of the championship, the Stanley Cup championship, and it was $4. So, and it was, they basically usually go from $125 to $250. And so I got that one for $4. And then about 3 years later, I found another buy it now for $50. So I actually have two of the.
Was your hand shaking when you found the $4 one?
Yeah, it was. Literally it was shaking. Like it was hard to go for the, and then I was lucky enough to get those last two that I showed. They were a combined set at a private auction, online auction thing. And I guess there weren't any, so I got them at a third the price I'd ever seen, lowest price I'd ever seen. So it really did my heart good to actually own them.
Oh, that's great. Bill Burton, can you unmute yourself, please, and tell us if we have any comments or questions?
I have a couple, thanks, Hal. Tony Hine has written that the Trans-Canadian, Trans-Canada Highway that linked Montreal, Manitoba, and Ontario with the rest of Canada wasn't completed until 1962.
Yeah.
Was that a problem? I mean, the railroad, were they still taking passengers at that point?
Oh yeah, the railway was still taking passengers. Yeah, but I remember as a kid coming out here on the Trans-Canada Highway, and it was gravel, and it was just about like a terrible trip on a hot summer's day, and no air conditioning in the cars, and you got the windows open, the gravel's flying through. Like it was, and that was the Trans-Canada Highway.
Alan Milbrandt wants to point out that the Rob McInnes postcard collection can be found online here. That's, how many cards do you have on the in the collection?
Oh, the one that's online, that one is actually hosted by the Winnipeg Public Library. It's called Past Forward. And so if you wanted to find it, you do Past Forward, all one word, or even just Postcards and my name, and it'll pop up in a Google search real fast. And there's my collection now of Manitoba and the Keewatin Kenora area, which I'm now focusing on, is probably like somewhat over 6,000 cards. And online there they have about 2,000, I think.
Brendan Murray points out that the Manitoba Championship trophy pictured is the Lake of the Woods, is in the Lake of the Woods Museum. Is that
the trophies here
to get to look at?
Yeah, the trophy is in the case just on the other side of the wall from Rob.
Oh, that's convenient.
Guess what I'm going to look at.
Otherwise, we're a little short on comments, so anybody wants to jump in, please do. Stick up your hand. I see Hal Ottaway sticking up his hand first.
Well, I just wanted for Rob, like I told you, that we have practiced this program. We do all of them. But one of the things that we mentioned the other day, or Rob mentioned, was about the firehouse. He told about it, several of them burning down, which I don't think I've ever heard of before happening, but I think anything's possible. But tell us about that wonderful tower.
Oh, yeah, right. That was something. I mean, I totally am. Once I got into postcard collecting, like it consumed me, and I see a lot of people here are likewise consumed. But, and I've always loved history. I did terrible in history in high school because everything was about dates. Like, when did this happen? When did that happen? I couldn't remember numbers. So I did terrible in history, even though I loved it. And then all of a sudden I just got postcard. And I said, if there's a date that's important, all I have to do is write it down. Like, this is great. Anyways, so the portal that postcards are into history is the thing that really grabs me. And so one of the fun things that I did learn along the way through postcard collecting was, because I knew fire stations are still around, and they've got old fire stations, and they got their big tower. And I always thought it was, well, in the old days, they'd like have somebody up there watching for smoke or something. But in fact, what they're for was for drying their hoses, that they would hang their hoses from the top of the tower down and they would dry faster.
That makes sense.
Robert Bell wants to know, for the fun of it, have you ever tried to colorize a black and white card from your collection?
Have I tried? Well, I was like, yeah, I did that with, like I do it every time I'm kind of have the fancy. It was a program that cost me like $50 or something. And, so I can colorize a card. And then, and those programs, like the good ones, they'll do their own version of colorizing, but they'll allow you to adjust, if you think the color's too much, you can lighten the color, or you brighten up the scenes or whatever. So yeah, I do it, I know 3 or 4 months, maybe, just for the fun of it.
Actually, my question was, have you ever colorized one that the printer had also colorized and compared the two of them, just to see how close, or if there's anything that you can pick out by doing it? I know it's something I'm going to try on some of mine. Well,
the printers, like the colored printed postcards.
Yeah, they would have done it by hand.
But, right, exactly. So, I mean, I ran into a guy once, the head of the Manitoba Historical Society, said, "Oh, I love those color postcards, because with the black and whites, you never knew what color buildings were," And I said, yeah. They were painted by some ladies over in Europe, like.
Well, that was, I was just thinking, just the fun of it, to see how the program compares to how the
exactly art. You're right. But the colorized ones, like now with the technology that's available, I mean, it really is. It analyzes the shades of gray or whatever on the postcard, and it pulls up whatever the real color was for the most part. But it really depends on the quality of the color postcard, or the colorized postcard will depend on the quality of the original photograph that you're using. Some are frankly just junk, because they can't the artificial intelligence can't figure out what was going on with the color. But
what's the name of the software?
I'm not sure what mine is. Yeah, I'm not sure. I should. There's a lot of them around, and they're probably all pretty decent. But if you want to send me an email or something, I'll be happy to answer. I just don't know offhand.
Okay, thanks.
I've used the one with My Heritage. It's a genealogy program.
Okay. It works pretty good.
Yeah. And I've just got a free version.
Oh, well, there you go. Get his free version. Mine costs $50.
Sterling Dean says, any of the photographers or publishers branch out, or do they all stay local?
Could you repeat that?
Did any of the photographers or publishers branch out into other parts of the province or along the railroad, or they just stay local pretty much?
No, those photographers, while they lived in Kenora, they stayed pretty much in the Kenora area. So I haven't seen any of those local guys do anything far out of this immediate area. Like, some of them moved and may have produced postcards. I'm sure that George Whiten, he moved to I think he moved to BC. He moved to BC, and he was doing photographs. I don't know if he did postcards, but I haven't found a postcard of his, but he was still doing photography. But
okay, that's what's all in the bucket. Hal, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments, please?
I just posted one little comment on when Rob mentioned buying postcards on the train.
Oh, please tell us.
And actually, many of the the railways actually had functioning post offices right on the trains.
Wow.
So oftentimes, I mean, they would just, they would have like separate mail cards where they'd actually be carrying the mail and they'd be sorting the mail and, going through and postmarking it. And oftentimes, you can find postcards which actually have that right on the postmark, where it would say like Winnipeg Central Station or,
Yeah.
whatever, which would have been the closest postal outlet to the railway stop.
Are those cards with the railway postmark hard to find? Sounds like they'd be brutally difficult.
They're pretty common.
Yeah, they're pretty
Really?
common. Yeah, they would have the RPO.
RPO.
Anytime you see RPO, that's the railway post office or railroad post office.
Yeah.
And people sat on the train. I mean, coming from Eastern Canada to Kenora or Winnipeg, you're on the train for hours, like days, and you had nothing to do. So they were selling these postcards, and that's what people did. They sat there and they wrote one after another,
Yeah.
passed the time, and then they put them in the mail, and they were postmarked with that postmark. So there are obviously people that in the philately community who just do nothing but collect those RPO postmarks. And postcards is the place you get them. That's why you can always find them at sales of sort of philatelic sales, because they tend to be collected by people who collect postmarks.
We're just so pleased to have had you, Rob, and thank you for doing it for us. And thank you, Bill Burton, for helping us with the questions today. Okay.
How could I just one
Sure,
thing?
please.
Yeah, I just wanted to do it right at the beginning so I wouldn't forget, but I forgot to do it at the beginning. But I just wanted to say hi to all the folks that are on here from California. I actually lived in California in Santa Cruz for 10 years. So it was really nice to see that there were some Californians here today. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, thanks again to everybody for being here today. We'll see you next month.